family formation law, and how does an attorney come to be involved?
Well, family formation law is an extremely specialized area of law, which is also very much not developed, and it's continuously developing, and that's the part of the family formation law that is unique. It's specialized, yet it's not completely set with how the law has guidelines. It has certain guidelines, like for instance, Family Code 7613 covers about what the rights are of an intended parent if they are to use assisted reproduction to have a child. In a situation like that, legally under the code currently, those intended parents are the ones that are rightfully, morally, ethically, legally, in every sense of the word, the parents of this child that is eventually conceived. Now the legalities come into the picture because you're dealing with a part of a body that is being donated in this process of conception. And that is where all the wonderful questions and all the wonderful debates pretty much come into the picture, both legally, both morally, in reality. So family formation law in a nutshell is basically that, putting together and creating a family, and the legal part of it is making sure that legally these parents are the parents.
Alice, let's talk about the scope of attorney-client retainer agreement.
Okay, so the attorney-client retainer agreement pretty much comes in the picture because at the same time when I come in the picture as the attorney. And that's already at a time where the couple has already been matched with a donor or a surrogate, or donor and a surrogate, depending on the situation, and all the FDA guidelines have been met. So at this point, the scope of the agreement of my relationship with the clients, for instance, in this matter, the intended parents, would be to pretty much put everything in writing and legalize and memorialize this arrangement that, let's say, they've already been in the process of with the agency, for instance, like Simple Steps Fertility, who is a wonderful agency. I've worked with them many times at this point, and they're amazing at explaining the process and going through the process with the clients, and in such great detail. And they're basically the liaison of all of the arrangement. So they will be the one in contact with me as the appointments are happening with these intended parents, most of the time in that instance. So they already have a great idea of what the arrangement is, what they're understanding. Now, the scope of my involvement is for them to truly understand what is this arrangement, because now we're going to make it legal. We're going to turn this and put it in a contract, put it in some kind of writing, memorializing the arrangement. And there's a lot of things that they need legal consultation on. For example, I'll give you an explanation. So clearly we understand that we now have embryos that the couple is going to use to conceive and have a child. Whether these embryos are with the couple's biological, the egg and the semen, or through the donation process. So regardless of that, we need to speak about what happens during, we're talking about married couples in this example or scenario. What happens in times of a divorce? What happens when the couple separates and you still have embryos? Now, it's treated like contractually. I mean, these embryos are embryos that can be used in this type of assisted reproduction to have children in the future. Now, who has these kids? Let's talk about custody of these embryos. I know they're not children, but this is the issue. So we would sit as attorney with the clients and talk about, what do you want to do? Because you cannot use this embryo upon separation or divorce if you are the husband who, let's say, it didn't work out and you didn't end up having a child, and now you're divorcing and you have a new relationship with whom you'd like to have a child and you no longer can. Now, what happens? Well, you need the consent of the woman with whom you created this embryo with. The egg belongs to the woman. What happens? So if she doesn't consent, these are the issues that we would talk about. How about upon death? If one of you dies, what happens? There's a lot of issues like that require a full detailed consultation in depth with the client, so they understand what they're
what
rights
they're
are.
doing.
Yeah.
Their obligations, their rights, because they own the embryos, regardless if it's through donation or whatnot. So there's so much, but in a nutshell, to give you one example at least, that would be a good one.
Alice, if it's possible, let's elaborate on the role of the attorney for the intended parents.
Sure. Well, as I was telling you, Arsha, Luis, about the scope. I mean, the scope of our representation includes, specifically what my role is going to be for them as well, because that's pretty much how the retainer agreement is with them. That they first have to understand what my role is, and within my role, I pretty much elaborate on what their rights are and what the scope is. So it kind of goes together in a way. And to be specific about the intended parents, they need the legal advice on their rights and their obligations as they enter into such an agreement, such an arrangement of assisted reproduction where there's a donor involved specifically, or even not. They need to know that they are the legal rightful parents of the child that is conceived through this process with donation. Now, under the law right now, which is pretty much Family Code section 7613 covers that specific area that I mentioned, that the intended parents are the legal rightful parents of this child that is born through assisted reproduction, where there's a donation by a young person, by a lady who donates an egg, for instance. In this situation, I am advising them of what the donor's rights are. A lot of the times what the agency does is the agency prepares them of everything. They pretty much already are matched up. They know what donor they're going to use. They know the agreement that they pretty much want in writing, but what they don't know are the consequences. What they don't know are the legal ramifications for certain situations that are foreseeable in the future. And, my job is, the cautionary, like, what if this happens? Nobody thinks of that. That's our job. What if, the uncomfortable topics is what I deal with, which is, well, what happens when you are no longer together? What happens when the donor doesn't do what the donor is supposed to do? And so the donor's obligations are important. What are the donor's rights? The donor has to comply, for instance. The donor has specific obligations to take the medications. Donor has also restrictions, like, for instance, they have to abstain from sexual activity. They have to have abstinence. They can't have piercings, for example. There's quite a lot of these restrictions. I just named a few of them. And so I go about the possibilities of what if that doesn't happen. And then we go into that discussion. What if it's very time sensitive? You're dealing with physicians, you're dealing with biological makeup of a person, you're dealing with retrieval process, which is a procedure, and the donor has to be there on time. Now let's look at the more important part. All the intended parents, almost, I want to say almost, not all, but most of them that I've experienced with are very much concerned about, well, it's mine, right? The child is mine, because they worry. They worry about the donor coming back. What would happen? And I assure them this is an anonymous process. More often than not, it's that. But it may be known or unknown, depending on what the couple has discussed and is comfortable with and has agreed with the matched donor. As we discussed, that already happens prior to me. The agency takes care of all of that. And so if, let's say, it's anonymous, I have to assure to them, look, we're going to write it up. The donor has no rights. Now, then we deal with the enforceability. Like I said, this area of law is unsettled. It's not, I advise them, I said, enforceability, we don't have a lot of case law on it where I can rely on and say this is the persuasive authority. This is the mandatory, we have certain codes that the family code covers, like one of them I mentioned about a reproductive, the rights of intended parents in terms of, using assisted reproduction, for instance. But overall, this area is so new and evolving, and so physicians too in the science, it's just fascinating on so many levels. But we discuss about the uncertainty. We discuss about the parameters of how much I can protect them with their agreement, but most importantly, it is currently the way it is. They are the parents, and I need to let them know, and they need to understand that this process is safe legally. The child that they have.
No need to be scared.
No need to be, yes, and the assurances. So a lot of times that's the main concern. What about if the donor comes back? Sometimes, I've had couples where they decide that it's okay, it's known instead of anonymous. And with the known one, sometimes they agree to meet, and that's kind of interesting. And sometimes they just agree to a specific, with boundaries. Instead of meeting, it might be like they'll share a picture at a certain time. So it all depends on how they've done it. If it's an anonymous one, then my agreement with them would be to protect whatever they have already agreed to, and then what legal protections I can advise on that. So in a nutshell, there's so much to cover, but that I think would give people a good general idea of what it's like to have an attorney and what the role is for this attorney when you're an intended parent.
Յուրաքանչյուրիս ձևավորման վրա մեծ ազդեցություն ունի մեր ժառանգությունը, մեր ընտանիքը, մեր համայնքը։ Մենք իմաստավորում ենք կյանքը մեր ընկալումներով ու գործերով։ Գործեր, որ կապրեն դարեդար։ Մարդկային հիշողությունը իսկական պարգև է։ Ամեն մի կյանք ստեղծում է իր սեփական ուղին։ Glendale Funeral Home հաստատությունը պատրաստ է ցուցաբերել հատուկ ուշադրություն իր բազմազան ծառայությունների շնորհիվ։
Join us on August 4th and 5th, well-known singer-songwriter Mikhail Zvizdinsky in Los Angeles at Maxim Restaurant and Banquet Hall.
Каждый день с тобой медовый месяц, я целую губы и глаза твои. Вместе, вместе.
Don't miss out. Be a part of this memorable event. Please call 323-653-7820 and RSVP. Seats are limited.
International Families Association is a non-profit organization. Կազմակերպություն, որ տարիներ շարունակ ծառայում է ի նպաստ ցածր եկամուտ ունեցող ընտանիքների։ Յուրաքանչյուր երկուշաբթի եւ չորեքշաբթի օրերին կեսօրից հետո ժամը 2-ից 5-ը տրամադրվում է անվճար ուտելիք եւ այլ ապրանքներ։ Ընդունվում է ամեն տեսակի հովանավորություն։ Մանրամասների համար զանգահարել 818-770-0779 հեռախոսահամարով։ Առևտրական ծանոթությունների համար զանգահարեք 818-653-0199 հեռախոսահամարով։
Alice, what kind of issues might the attorney for intended parents have with the attorney for the donor?
Well, one thing that the attorney for the intended parents can have as a dispute with the attorney for donor, or that can be negotiated, I should say, would be, the number of embryos that's remaining. What happens to that? There's so many issues with that. What happens? Even if, let's say, there's an issue and there's no consent on either end, what happens to these embryos? I mean, legally and ethically, you can't destroy them. So, the donor can negotiate and say if the donor wants to have any rights to that, that's one, a rare one. But what rights the donor would have in terms of, confidentiality, anonymous nature of the process, or whether or not the donor wants it to be known. So sometimes it happens, very rare, at least in my experience. It's always been pretty smooth. It's usually smooth, but we're talking about, dispute here. If it were to happen, it would be the donor changes their mind last minute And now we're kind of diving into their breach. At what point is the donor changing her mind in the case? So that would determine what kind of a dispute or negotiation are we going to do? What remedial measure are we going to take, depending on the timing? But if it's assuming before we sign, then a lot of the times the intended parents are forced to change the donor. They don't use it because they don't have a meeting of the minds at the end of the day. So that usually doesn't happen, but negotiations pretty much around those that I can think of generally.
So even a breach of contract can be negotiated.
Well, when you say breach of contract can be negotiated, that's as if any situation. You know, you're dealing with a very costly process for an intended parent, and yes, fees are involved. And so if a donor has already breached part of the terms within it, and enforceability is an issue, and if the two attorneys are able to resolve that, then definitely yes. So we can call it that a resolution to a breach, or a potential breach that's pretty much going to become actualized, and the attorney kind of alerts the other attorney saying, look, there's no intent here, but we pretty much cover those anyway in the agreement. We pretty much cover, for example, if no fault of the donor, the procedure falls through and they're not, what happens in that scenario? If it is the fault of the donor, like for instance, it's a time sensitive process and the donor doesn't show up for the doctor's appointment. Okay. Well, there was a extreme hardship situation where this is the reasoning, and that's where you can maybe talk. Do we want to give an excuse, or do we want to work it out, or do we want to call it a breach? So those are the delicacies of that situation. Yeah.
How does someone become a surrogate?
Well, surrogacy is completely a huge area of itself, just to let you know. It's to kind of, briefly explain to you how one would become one. There's a variety of ways. Are we talking about a surrogate that's just a stranger that wants to be helpful and wants to be part of this amazing journey for a couple and help them with a child? Then there's a lot of screenings that happen. There's requirements that they have to meet. For instance, one of the requirements that I can tell you is, they must have had the experience of given a childbirth. They must have had a baby at some point, and at least raising one child, for example. There's also psychological screenings that they must go through, clearances from therapists that they have to go through. It's a huge toll. I mean, you're talking about carrying a child. That's a beautiful process, but then having to give that child to someone else is I want everybody to think about the reality of what that is. So they really need to be prepared. Now, a surrogate can be a family member or a relative. I've had cases where a wonderful lady who had 2 kids wanted to do it for her sister-in-law. And the sister-in-law was diagnosed with a certain illness, but the sister-in-law, for instance, had kids of their own and had issues. And so a relative might step in, and the requirements are a little bit different. Surrogacy is obviously, there's contractual issues along with that. And with surrogacy, there's also court involvement, because it's not just contracts and we end there, because if I'm representing a surrogate, I have different requirements that I have to consult her on, and I would be advising her of those things. And then at the end, the surrogate also wants to make sure that she's not legally responsible for the baby, right? Those are her rights are only limited to carrying this baby to term and fulfilling the requirements of being healthy and whatnot, and all the standards. Now, what happens after the baby? Right before the baby. That's where the attorney comes in. And some counties are different. LA County is the one that requires us as lawyers to be in court and actually get a court order. So we'd have to file documents and get from the court an order saying that who the intended parents are. And this is what helps the hospitals when the baby is delivered and the baby comes. They now have all the proper legal documents to actually do the proper birth certificate and name the legal parents as the intended parents. So that's kind of how the surrogacy, in a nutshell, in a very, very brief nutshell, works.
The retainer is drawn and everybody signs it. What's the next step?
The next step is my happy process step, is what I call it, actually. So it is the part of law that I enjoy, actually, is I get the smiles. The next step is, we're done with the agreement pretty much. And, without getting too technical, the legal clearance letters are basically sent to the physicians. Specific letters are drawn up. The donor's attorney might send it to me, and I send it to physicians, or, all those letters are done. Clearance is taken care of, and then we just congratulate the couple and, wish them the best. Sometimes they share pictures when the babies come, and it's just beautiful. I just enjoy it so much.
Hello, my name is Tegui Sarkisian, and I am the founder of Simple Steps Fertility. Simple Steps Fertility is an egg donor surrogacy agency and an infertility support center for couples who are struggling with infertility. My journey in infertility started 14 years ago, and I'm happy to say that today, having a family, reaching that goal has been easier than ever. I have been lucky enough to be working with Alice for the last couple of years. Alice is an incredible attorney with great professionalism and a plethora of knowledge. She's an asset in the legal field. With the collaboration of medicine and law, we're here to help you create your family. Please don't hesitate. Take the next step. Let's talk a little bit about the process. The process begins with the recipient family choosing the right egg donor. The egg donor at this point has to go through a couple of steps to ensure that they're ready for a cycle. The first step is a medical screen. A medical screen is conducted by the reproductive endocrinologist that the family is working with. The medical screen is also to ensure that the donor is healthy enough to continue with the cycle. They have to be tested for sexually transmitted diseases. They have to be tested for genetic carrier testing, and also an ultrasound to ensure that the ovaries look good. The next step is a psychological screen. This is to ensure that the donor understands what she is doing and she is not coerced or forced to undergo egg donation. Lastly, there is legal counsel, and that's where Alice comes in. It's the most important part of the third-party cycle. This is where the recipient couple and the donor are represented by attorneys to ensure that what they decide amongst each other is legal and protecting both parties.
Յուրաքանչյուրիս ձևավորման վրա մեծ ազդեցություն ունի մեր ժառանգությունը, մեր ընտանիքը, մեր համայնքը։ Մենք իմաստավորում ենք կյանքը մեր ընկալումներով ու գործերով։ Գործեր, որ կապրեն դարեդար։ Մարդկային հիշողությունը իսկական պարգև է։ Ամեն մի կյանք ստեղծում է իր սեփական ուղին։ Glendale Funeral Home հաստատությունը պատրաստ է ցուցաբերել հատուկ ուշադրություն իր բազմազան ծառայությունների շնորհիվ։
Join us on August 4th and 5th, well-known singer-songwriter Mikhail Zvizdinsky in Los Angeles at Maxim Restaurant and Banquet Hall.
Как аккорды песни нас связала музыка любви. Каждый день с тобой медовый месяц, я целую губы и глаза твои. Вместе, вместе.
Don't miss out. Be a part of this memorable event. Please call 323-653-7820 and RSVP. Seats are limited.
International Families Association is a non-profit organization. Կազմակերպություն, որ տարիներ շարունակ ծառայում է ի նպաստ ցածր եկամուտ ունեցող ընտանիքների։ Յուրաքանչյուր երկուշաբթի եւ չորեքշաբթի օրերին կեսօրից հետո ժամը 2-ից 5-ը տրամադրվում է անվճար ուտելիք եւ այլ ապրանքներ։ Ընդունվում է ամեն տեսակի հովանավորություն։ Մանրամասների համար զանգահարել 818 770 0779 հեռախոսահամարով։
For advertising on Inside TV, please call 818-653-0199.